Hey guys, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how I drew this cat eye study using coloured pencils. I'm also going to give you some useful tips along the way. I'm Kirsty Rebecca and I make drawing and painting tutorials that are easier to follow even if you're just starting out. I'm working on Clairefontaine Pastelmat, which is one of my favourite papers to use with coloured pencil because it allows me to add lighter colours on top of darker colours, especially with the method of blending that I'm using with this piece, which is solvent. I chose a mid-tone colour because it's a bit easier to be able to see lighter colours and darker colours on top of this paper, whereas if you start out with a white paper, sometimes it can be a little hard to judge how dark you're going because the white of the paper sort of alters the perception of how dark or light that colour is. And also you can only add darker colours to white paper, so you sort of have to work from light to dark, which isn't really a natural way for me to work. So I usually prefer to work with a mid-tone colour if I can. I'm using a sort of orange sienna kind of colour, but you can use whatever mid-tone colour you have, so grey or brown or anything like that will be fine. When I'm doing my base layers in coloured pencil on Pastelmat blending with solvent, I like to start out with the Derwent drawing pencils first because I find that they are really creamy and opaque when you blend them out with the solvent. But with this set of pencils, they only come in 24 colours and they're sort of really earthy, natural sort of colours, so they're really great for animals and things like that, but there isn't a really wide selection of colours. So if I can't find the colour that I need in that set for my base layer, and then I'll move on to a different wax base set usually. So I'll move on to like the Caran d'Ache Luminance and find the colour in that set. But honestly, it doesn't really matter what coloured pencils you use. You can use the Polychromos, which are oil based, or Prismacolor. Any colour pencil will work for this technique. I just find that you may need a couple more layers of pencil when you're using the oil based pencils. So my end result is going to be much lighter than what I'm doing in the base layer here. So I'm sort of going for a slightly darker mid-tone color for the base layer. So that way I can add my brightest highlights and darkest darks on top of this layer as well. So I find that a mid-tone color is a great base layer to work on because you can add darks and lights on top of that. And in the white sections of the fur, I am going in with a white pencil, but I'm also adding in blues and oranges and other colors in there as well, because white fur, or any fur in general, reflects the colors around it, but white is especially reflective of the colors around it. So you'll notice that in a lot of animals that have white fur or black fur, there's a lot of blues and purples and that kind of thing reflected in the white. So you don't want to just go straight in with white because it can look quite flat. So I like to add in a lot more of those blues and oranges and things in the first layer, and that way I can go on top with the white highlights and it will show that color underneath that I've put there. So now that I've got a few layers of colored pencil down, I'm going to come in with the solvent. So I like to keep mine in a separate little jar, and I just pour a little bit in there from the main bottle, and that way if my jar becomes contaminated with any excess sort of pencil pigment, it won't contaminate my entire bottle of solvent. And if you let it settle in this jar overnight, and then you can actually tip out the clean solvent that's on top of this jar and use that again. So depending on the paper that you're working on, you'll need different amounts of solvent. So in my first layer, I use a little bit more solvent than I would towards the end because I really want these colors to blend out nice and softly together. But towards the end, I want some of those first strokes to show through. So if I use the solvent again throughout this piece, I might use a little bit less solvent so it doesn't blend completely. But I just use an old brush. You don't want to use any of your good brushes because it can damage the brush, especially if you're working on Pastelmat with solvent. I just dip it into my jar of solvent and then dab off the excess onto a paper towel and then just go into my drawing. And you want to make sure that your brush strokes are going in the same direction as the fur as well. So just keep in mind that if you go against the direction of the fur, those brush strokes may show through in the end result. So throughout the entire piece, just make sure that you're going in the same direction as the fur. And as you can see, blending this way makes those colors really vibrant and it takes away a lot of the graininess of the pencil. So before I show you the next step, if you want to follow along with my longer real-time tutorials where I talk you through every step of the process, then Patreon might be the solution for you. For a small amount per month, you'll have access to every tutorial that I've previously uploaded on your chosen tier level in a variety of mediums like pastel, coloured pencil, graphite, watercolour and more. You will also have access to the original reference photo, a traceable outline, and a list of supplies that I'm using so you really can follow along every step of the way. My tutorials don't skip any stages or cut out any important parts of the process, and I will share all of my secrets to help you improve. Every month, I will upload brand new tutorials to the library so you can grow and develop your drawing and painting skills and take your art to the next level. You can also join in on our members chat group where you can ask questions or advice or share your artwork and talk to other members in the Patreon community. The link is in the description if you want to check it out. So I really love working with solvent because it means that you can be a little bit messier with your pencil strokes, knowing that they're going to blend out pretty well when you use the solvent. Whereas if you're working on like a smooth paper or watercolor paper and you're just layering your pencil on top of each other, or using the burnishing technique where you push really hard on the paper to smooth out your colors, you do have to have your pencil at a really sharp point. And you have to work in almost tiny little circles or tiny little strokes to make sure that they look perfect, because you can't have a lot of this graininess showing because it may show through in your end result that way. Whereas when you're working on pastel mat like this, you can use a pencil that's not so sharp and you'll still get really nice results in the end. So now that I've got my base layer down, I'm coming back through with more details in the next layer. So for this, I like to use the Faber-Castell Polychromos because I find that the point is easier to get a little bit sharper and it stays sharper for longer because it's a bit of a harder pencil. But I don't always stick to the Polychromos when I'm doing my details. I just pick the brand of pencil depending on the color that I'm after. So I might start by looking through the Polychromos because I prefer using those for details. But if I don't have the color in there, and then I'll move on to another set of pencils. So you don't have to have all the different sets of pencils that I have. You can just use whatever set you have. So I will be blending out this layer with solvent again, so I'm not too worried about having the details perfect, but I am starting to get in the general textures of all the different fur details. So when you're drawing fur, you want to make sure that your pencil strokes are going in the right direction, but you also want to make sure that you're varying your strokes slightly as well. So even though they are going in the same general direction, you want to make sure that some start and stop at different points or curve slightly in a different direction. You don't want them all to be exactly the same lining up in a row. You want them to be varied slightly, but you still want them to go in the right general direction. And you want to make sure that you're paying attention to your length of your pencil strokes as well. So in any areas where the fur is slightly longer, you want to do longer pencil strokes there, and in the shorter areas, do shorter pencil strokes. So one of the biggest problems that I see beginners do when they're starting out blending with solvent or mineral spirits or natural alternatives like Zest It is that they don't have enough colored pencil down on their paper before they go in with the solvent. What happens if you don't have enough pigment down is that you sort of go in with the solvent and it doesn't really change anything. It still looks quite grainy and it didn't really blend anything out. And the reason for that is because there's not enough color or pigment down on your paper for the solvent to blend together. So you want to make sure that you have quite a lot of layers of pencil down so that the solvent has something to blend together. It's not a big deal if you didn't have enough layers down and you realize that once you've already gone in to blend, but just stop what you're doing and let it dry for 15 minutes, half an hour or so, depending on the paper that you're using, and then add more layers of pencil and come back through and blend again. You also want to make sure that your drawing is completely dry before you go into your next layer, because if the paper's still damp from the solvent, you may damage the paper with your pencils. So I usually wait about half an hour or so, and that's probably a bit excessive, but I like to make sure that my paper's completely dry so I don't damage it at all. And so you probably would have noticed, but the way that I like to work is in layers. So I'll start out with a base layer and then I'll create some texture with the next layer, starting to do some fur details and that kind of thing. And then I'll blend that out again and I'll add in more details in the following layers. And I just keep building up my piece until I'm happy with how it looks. Whereas a lot of other people start in a certain section, like they'll start on the eye and then complete that fully before moving on to the fur. So I find that for me, when I work that way, when I work in sections like that, my work becomes disjointed and not really cohesive because I can't remember the colors and like the order I laid them down in and how much of each color that I used in each section. I also find that my shadows sometimes aren't dark enough and my highlights aren't light enough because I don't have anything else to compare it to. Whereas if I build up my artwork in layers, working on the whole piece as I go along in each layer, I can build up my values, so my darks and my highlights, as I go along and judge them against each other, so I can make sure that my whole piece looks cohesive and realistic that way. So whatever works best for you, do that, but my process is by working in layers. So I found that a lot of people worry about their color choices a lot with their drawings and paintings. The color is not actually that important in making something look realistic. It's actually your values that are more important. So for the eye, I could have picked from a variety of different colored blues. So you don't have to pick the exact same hue as that blue that you see in your reference photo. As long as it's not too dark or too light, it will look fine and it will look realistic. And you can always try it. So put that color that you've chosen down, and if you think it doesn't look quite right, you can layer other colors on top of it or just change the color as you go along. It doesn't have to be exactly the same as the photo, as long as your shadows are dark enough and your highlights are light enough. The two things that are more important when it comes to making something look realistic is your initial outline, so making sure that all of your proportions are right and everything is in the right place and that kind of thing. And then also your values. So if you're not sure if your values are right, something that I do towards the end of my drawings is take a photo of my artwork and then turn it into black and white, and then get my reference photo and turn that into black and white as well, and then compare them side by side. And because you've taken away the distraction of the color, you'll be able to see whether your shadows are as dark as a reference photo, and then you can actually go into your artwork and change it if you need to. Usually people don't have a problem with going too light. It's usually the darks that they haven't got dark enough. So doing that is a really great way to check if your values are right. Another good tip when you're working on fur like this, especially if you're trying to get really bright highlights, if you can't get those highlights using your Faber-Castell Polychromos or any oil-based pencil, or even your Caran d'Ache Luminance or Prismacolor, if you're struggling to get those really bright highlights, you can actually use the Derwent drawing. The Derwent drawing is a lot more opaque than the other colored pencils that I've found, so especially the Chinese white, that one is super opaque in comparison to any other colored pencil that I've found. So if you are struggling to get those brighter whites, try using one of those pencils. And then I'm just coming through with a Faber-Castell Polychromos Warm Grey 2. And this pencil specifically, along with a few other pencils by Faber-Castell, are really great for smoothing out any of the graininess. So some colors that you lay down, like a lot of the Caran d'Ache Luminance or the Derwent drawing, can look quite grainy. And then you get other pencils, like some of the ones from the Faber-Castell set, that aren't really grainy at all, and they can actually help soften out the graininess of other pencils, especially on the Clairefontaine Pastelmat. So I like to use the Warm Grey 2 or the Cold Grey as well. Those ones work quite well, and because they're not really dark or really light, they don't tint the color too much, they just help blend out those colors. If you wanted to see how I created this piece in real time with voiceover instructions step by step along the way, you can check out my Patreon channel. There's a link in the description below. Otherwise, there's a playlist on the screen with some other tutorials that I thought you might find useful, so click on that and I'll see you over there.